New Zealand needs to decriminalise cannabis. Everyone seems to agree with this policy. Even many of the opponents of legalisation seem to agree with decriminalisation. Why has cannabis not yet been decriminalised? Why was the Labour government too cowardly to implement this widely supported progressive reform? Many insist that in a de facto sense, cannabis is already decriminalised. Yet there are still very real legal penalties which can be applied to cannabis usage. Cannabis use is still very much illegal. The current approach gives the police a substantial amount of discretion over the issue. This is not good enough. When the police are given discretion, you end up with arbitrary legal outcomes. When the police are given discretion, you end up with discriminatory legal outcomes. The police exist to enforce the law, not to create it. We need a policy of simple decriminalisation, not weak, cowardly half measures that maintain criminalisation while trying to soften it. That is not good enough. Labour should have decriminalised cannabis properly, but they didn't because they were weak and cowardly. They were afraid of actually standing for anything. They had all the power, and for the most part, they sat by and presided over the status quo. We need to decriminalise cannabis. We need to decriminalise cannabis usage. We need to decriminalise limited growth and possession of cannabis. This long overdue and widely supported policy has for unknown reasons not yet been implemented. Instead, an array of weak half measures have been implemented. These weak half measures have softened criminalisation, but many feel its harsher side nonetheless. The solution is not weak half measures that give undue discretion to police and fail to fully alleviate the evils of criminalisation. The criminalisation of cannabis use is both inhumane and a waste of taxpayer money. Harmless behaviour should not be punished by the state. Cannabis criminalisation represents an authoritarian measure, an unjustified excess of state power. Some may think that this does not concern them. In truth, this criminalisation affects us all. There is no good reason to criminalise cannabis. If the government can oppress people without good reasons, we are all in danger. This is a hideous precedent, and every day that cannabis remains criminalised, this precedent lives on. We should hold the state to higher standards. We should expect the state will only punish and police when it has a good reason for doing so. This expectation is the only thing between us and a chaotic, authoritarian society. It is vital that we create and maintain the expectation that the government behave on a rational, justified basis. As soon as that basis is corroded, every evil becomes possible. The criminalisation of cannabis represents an affront to the desirable expectation that the state be rational and reasonable. The criminalisation of cannabis is a threat to us all, because it establishes and upholds a precedent by which the state can hurt and oppress without good cause. Liberty must triumph over tradition. Some people will insist that if we ever decriminalised cannabis, everyone would start using cannabis. Just because it is decriminalised does not mean you should do it. Have some self-control. You can avoid cannabis without having some nanny state ban you from using it. For God's sake, I support cannabis legalization, but I have never used cannabis, and I have no interest in ever using cannabis. Have some self-control. We can't have a nanny state dictating our every move. We need to have some self-control and make some good decisions for ourselves. That is how the state encourages citizens to be responsible. Only if you have the capacity to make an undesirable decision can you choose to make a good one and develop self-control. By constraining us to an excessive degree, the nanny state prevents people from learning self-control. Soon people think they just wouldn't be able to help using cannabis if it were decriminalized. This is what some people will say. I don't want it decriminalized because if it was, I might use it. This is what some people genuinely use as their reasoning against decriminalization. Develop some self-control. You shouldn't need some nanny state to manage your decisions for you. I don't endorse cannabis use, but decriminalization is obviously the correct answer. We should not criminalize something unless we have a good reason for doing so, and there is no good reason to criminalize cannabis use. Sure, cannabis may do some harm to some of its users, but if we banned everything that does some harm to some of its users, we would be living in a totalitarian society. Because a massively authoritarian state is the logical conclusion of this nanny state logic. The reality is that the state should exist, but it should have a more limited role. It should only intervene in our lives when there is a good reason for doing so, a very good reason. The state must only police and punish when there is a very good reason for doing so. That expectation is the only thing standing between us and a chaotic, dictatorial society.